Owen Hale often joked that he had spent so many years repairing other people's dreams that he'd forgotten what his own looked like. The mechanics at Bay 12 laughed every time he said it because they understood exactly what he meant. Passenger liners arrived with anxious families desperate to make a wedding on another colony. Freight captains stormed into the maintenance office demanding impossible deadlines because every hour their ships remained docked cost someone a fortune. Mining tugs limped into the station, barely holding themselves together after months beyond civilized space, and Owen always managed to coax one more voyage out of engines that probably should have been retired years earlier. For 23 years, he had been the man other people called when something precious refused to work. Yet every evening, he returned to the same cramped apartment overlooking the station's recycling yards, heated another frozen dinner, and fell asleep wondering where all the years had gone. His toolbox had grown larger. His savings account had grown slightly healthier. Everything else had remained stubbornly unchanged. He was 46 years old, owned little more than a wardrobe full of grease-stained coveralls, and rented an apartment so small he could touch opposite walls without taking more than 4 steps. Every few months, someone suggested he buy a newer transport shuttle or finally put a down payment on a proper station condo, but neither idea ever appealed to him. Owen had repaired enough modern equipment to know most of it was built with expiration dates hidden somewhere inside. Plastic where steel once belonged. Sealed components that couldn't be repaired, only replaced. Everything disposable, everything temporary. If he ever spent the savings he'd scraped together over 2 decades of overtime, he wanted it to be on something meant to last. Unfortunately, nothing within his budget seemed to fit that description until an ordinary Tuesday afternoon changed everything. He had wandered into the station salvage office during his lunch break, hoping to find an inexpensive hydraulic press for the little workshop he kept promising himself he'd someday own. Instead, he found broker Hollis leaning against a terminal, muttering about a freight ship nobody wanted. "She's been sitting in dock ring 9 for nearly 11 years, Hollis complained to another broker while scrolling through inspection reports. "Scrappers won't touch her because the towing fees cost more than the steel's worth." Owen wasn't paying attention until a grainy photograph appeared on the monitor. The ship filled nearly the entire screen. Long, weathered, beautiful in the stubborn way only old working vessels could be. The faded name across her bow read Hearthfire. Something about her proportions caught his eye immediately. She wasn't graceful like a luxury liner or aggressive like a patrol cruiser. She looked dependable, built by people who expected hard work rather than admiration. "Mind if I see that listing?" Owen asked before he had fully realized he'd spoken. Hollis shrugged and turned the monitor toward him. The inspection report was brutal. Primary reactor permanently offline. Environmental systems unreliable. Navigation obsolete. Interior stripped during partial salvage attempts. Estimated restoration costs exceeded market value several times over. At the bottom of the report, highlighted in red, appeared the recommendation, "Sell for scrap." Owen ignored almost every word on the page. Instead, he studied the structural diagrams attached farther down. Thick load-bearing frames, service corridors large enough for mechanics to actually work inside, modular plumbing, accessible wiring, replaceable components. Good bones, really good bones. "How much?" he asked quietly. Hollis looked up, expecting sarcasm, but Owen's expression remained serious. "You don't want this headache," the broker replied. "Trust me. Humor me." The broker sighed, typed several figures into the terminal, then turned the screen around once more. Owen stared silently at the number. It represented nearly everything he had managed to save in 23 years. Every overtime shift, every vacation he hadn't taken, every old jacket he'd worn one more winter instead of replacing. Rational people would have laughed, thanked the broker for his time, and walked away. Owen surprised himself by asking the only question that mattered. "Can I see her first?" Less than an hour later, he stood alone on the quiet docking platform outside berth 17, while the massive hull of the Hearthfire stretched above him like an abandoned cathedral of steel. Layers of faded paint peeled gently beneath decades of station air. Docking scars covered her flanks like wrinkles earned through honest work. Several windows remained dark behind dusty glass, while others reflected the busy station surrounding her with silent indifference. She looked tired, forgotten, unwanted. Owen stepped closer until one gloved hand rested against the cool metal of the hull. "You've still got plenty of years left," he murmured almost without thinking. The words escaped before he realized how ridiculous they sounded. Ships didn't need encouragement. They certainly didn't listen. Yet standing there beside that weathered hull, Owen felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he cared to admit. Possibility. By sunset, the paperwork was complete. Broker Hollis handed over an old access card attached to a faded plastic tag that still read, "Hearthfire, primary owner," then shook his head as though witnessing a perfectly sensible man make an astonishingly poor decision. Owen thanked him, carried 2 duffel bags and a battered toolbox across the gangway, and waited while the heavy airlock cycled open for the first time under his authorization. Warm, stale air drifted outward, carrying the unmistakable smell of old machinery, dry dust, and forgotten years. The interior lights remained dark until he manually activated emergency power from a nearby panel. One by one, pale amber fixtures flickered uncertainly to life down the forward corridor, revealing steel walls dulled by age, deck plates coated in fine gray dust, and silence so complete that his own footsteps seemed almost intrusive. Owen smiled despite himself. It wasn't much to look at. In fact, most people would have called it hopeless. He set his bags beside the nearest bulkhead, unclipped a flashlight from his belt, and started walking. The bridge still contained its original command chairs, beneath protective dust covers. The galley was stripped of anything valuable but otherwise intact, its long stainless steel counters merely waiting for another cook. Crew cabins lined the port corridor with doors hanging open exactly as inspectors had left them years earlier. Every room whispered stories of ordinary people who had once lived and worked there before quietly moving on. Owen chose a modest cabin near the galley simply because it received the most natural light through its small exterior window. By midnight, he had assembled a folding cot, unpacked his clothes into one battered locker, plugged in an electric kettle, and placed his father's old toolbox beneath the window where morning light would reach it. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't finished. But for the first time in his adult life, every wall surrounding him belonged to no landlord, no corporation, and no lease agreement. Before climbing into bed, Owen switched off the cabin light and stood looking through the doorway into the silent corridor beyond. "Home," he whispered softly, testing the unfamiliar word. It felt strange, wonderful, earned. He had just begun drifting towards sleep when a faint metallic sound echoed somewhere deep within the ship. It wasn't loud enough to alarm him, more like the distant clink of a small tool settling against steel after being disturbed. Owen opened one eye and listened. Silence returned almost immediately. Old ships made noises. Bulkheads expanded and contracted with changing temperatures. Pipes creaked. Loose panels shifted. After spending 2 decades inside engine rooms, he knew better than to mistake every unexplained sound for a problem. Smiling to himself, he rolled onto his side and closed his eyes again. Far below the occupied decks, hidden beyond forgotten maintenance passages that no longer appeared on updated station schematics, another pair of eyes remained open for a long time after Owen finally fell asleep, quietly watching the faint glow of restored corridor lights reach places that had been dark for many years. Owen woke before the station's artificial sunrise, more from habit than comfort. Years spent reporting to Bay 12 before most of the docking rings stirred had trained his body to greet the morning without complaint, even after sleeping on a folding cot that protested every movement. He stretched, listened for a moment to the quiet hum of emergency power flowing through the ship, and smiled. It was different from the apartment. There, mornings began with neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, plumbing rattling in distant units, and elevators groaning up and down the building. Here, the silence felt alive rather than empty. Air moved gently through aging ducts. Somewhere deep beneath the deck, a circulation pump cycled on for a few seconds before settling once more. The old freighter seemed to breathe around him, slow and steady, as though relieved someone had finally returned. Owen filled the kettle, unpacked the single coffee mug he'd owned for nearly 15 years, and carried it into the galley while waiting for the water to boil. Sunlight from the station's enormous mirror arrays filtered through dusty windows, illuminating floating particles that drifted lazily through the air. It wasn't much of a kitchen yet. Most of the cabinets stood empty. Several drawers hung crooked on worn runners, and the induction stove would require at least 2 replacement control boards before it could cook anything more complicated than soup. Even so, Owen found himself grinning into his coffee. Every problem in the room had a solution. He'd spent his entire career solving harder ones than these. His first week aboard the hearth fire followed a comfortable rhythm. He worked 10-hour shifts at Bay 12, stopped by the surplus market on the way home whenever he found a bargain worth carrying, then devoted every evening to one small project before exhaustion sent him to bed. He refused to think about the ship as a mountain of work. Mountains discourage people. Individual tasks did not. Monday became lighting. Tuesday was spent tracing damaged electrical lines through the forward corridor until every fixture between the galley and his cabin glowed steadily instead of flickering. Wednesday, he repaired 2 plumbing leaks beneath the washroom sink using spare fittings salvaged from work. Thursday disappeared beneath layers of dust as he scrubbed the galley until stainless steel slowly reappeared beneath years of neglect. None of the improvements would have impressed anyone else, but Owen noticed everyone. The corridor looked warmer beneath steady lights. The cabin smelled cleaner after fresh air began circulating properly. The galley no longer felt abandoned. He had learned long ago that homes weren't transformed by grand renovations. They changed because hundreds of tiny jobs quietly accumulated until one day you stopped noticing what still needed fixing and started appreciating what already had been. On Friday evening, he returned carrying a second-hand toaster, 2 folding chairs, and a loaf of fresh bread from a bakery near the tram station. The toaster worked perfectly, despite a dent along one side. The chairs matched only in the broadest sense of the word. And the bread had been discounted because it would be considered day-old by morning. To Owen, it felt like a feast. He toasted 4 slices, spread butter across them while they were still warm, and ate slowly at the galley table with nothing but the station traffic beyond the window for company. After dinner, he wandered back toward his cabin carrying his empty plate, then stopped halfway down the corridor. He frowned. He distinctly remembered leaving the toolbox outside his cabin before dinner. Now it rested neatly against the wall beside the galley entrance, positioned so carefully that it sat perfectly parallel with the bulkhead. Owen stood looking at it for several seconds before quietly laughing at himself. "Long week," he muttered. He picked up the heavy box, carried it back to his cabin, and thought no more about it. He had been distracted while making dinner. He must have moved it without remembering. It wasn't exactly unheard of. More than once at work, he'd spent 5 minutes searching for a wrench already tucked into his back pocket. Far below the occupied decks, where emergency lighting had failed many years earlier, a narrow maintenance passage branched away from the official schematics into spaces created during the ship's original construction and forgotten by everyone except the people who had once worked there. The passage was barely tall enough for an adult to crawl through comfortably, but its smallest resident moved through it with practiced ease. She waited without making a sound until the steady rhythm of Owen's footsteps faded into the distance, then slowly eased open a narrow access hatch hidden behind a bank of inactive environmental controls. Cool air from the restored ventilation drifted gently across her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, smiling almost imperceptibly. The ship hadn't felt this warm in years. Clutching a small flashlight whose lens had been covered with layers of cloth to dim its beam, she slipped into the corridor and crossed silently toward the galley. Every step avoided loose deck plates she'd memorized long ago. Every movement had been practiced hundreds of times. The loaf of bread still rested on the counter where Owen had left it. She studied it for several seconds before reaching out with both hands. He had already eaten half. Taking another slice would be noticed. She withdrew her hand immediately. Instead, she quietly straightened one of the folding chairs that sat slightly crooked beneath the table, wiped away the ring left by his coffee mug with a folded cloth she carried in her pocket, and gently pushed his forgotten salt shaker back toward the center of the table where it belonged. Satisfied that everything looked just a little nicer than before, she hesitated one last time, broke off the smallest corner from the heel of the bread loaf, barely enough to fill the palm of her hand, and disappeared back into the darkness long before Owen wandered sleepily into the galley the following morning, wondering why the room somehow felt more welcoming than he remembered leaving it. Saturday was the first morning in years that Owen awoke without an alarm waiting to drag him out of bed. For several peaceful seconds, he simply lay beneath the blankets, listening to the ship around him. Somewhere overhead, a ventilation fan hummed with the steady confidence of a machine that had finally received the lubrication it had been begging for. Water expanded softly through recently repaired pipes as the station's day cycle warmed the outer hull. None of the sounds demanded his attention. They were simply reminders that the hearth fire was beginning to wake alongside him. He dressed slowly, brewed another pot of coffee, and decided that work could wait until after breakfast. Fresh bread still sat on the galley counter where he'd left it the night before. He frowned for only a moment as he reached for the loaf. Had he already cut off the end piece? He honestly couldn't remember. There was a rough corner missing from one end, hardly more than a mouthful, and for a second he considered whether he'd absent-mindedly torn it away while waiting for the toaster. The memory refused to cooperate. He shrugged, sliced two thick pieces, and smiled as they browned beneath the heating elements. "Guess I'm getting forgetful," he muttered, more amused than concerned. Living alone had a curious way of blurring little moments together. There was nobody to witness the tiny routines that filled each day. No one to remind you where you had left your keys or whether you'd already watered the plants. He carried his breakfast to the table beside the galley window and watched cargo traffic drift lazily across the docking ring while mentally planning the day's work. The bridge still needed cleaning. Several storage compartments remained untouched. If time allowed, he might even inspect the hydroponics bay listed on the original deck plans. It felt good to have more ideas than hours available to complete them. He spent most of the morning exploring instead of repairing. Every unopened hatch represented another piece of the ship's history waiting to be rediscovered, and Owen found that almost as satisfying as fixing broken machinery. He wandered through empty cargo holds large enough to swallow entire shuttlecraft, climbed maintenance ladders that disappeared into overhead service spaces, and opened forgotten lockers filled with little reminders that people had once called this vessel home. An old deck of playing cards tucked behind a pipe, a faded coffee mug with someone's name scratched into the side, a pair of work gloves hanging patiently on a hook exactly where their owner had left them years earlier. Owen never took those things back to his cabin. Somehow it felt wrong. Instead, he dusted them off, placed them neatly where they belonged, and quietly thanked the people who had unknowingly preserved little pieces of themselves aboard the hearthfire. By lunchtime, he had reached a narrow service workshop near the center of the ship, its benches buried beneath forgotten spare parts and sealed storage bins. Most of the containers held nothing particularly interesting: old bearings, wiring harnesses, hydraulic seals. But one small cabinet mounted beneath the workbench immediately caught his attention. Unlike everything else in the room, it had obviously been opened many times over the years. The hinges moved freely. Dust had been disturbed around the handle often enough that it never accumulated into the thick gray layer covering the surrounding shelves. Owen crouched beside it, curiosity getting the better of him. Inside sat a remarkably tidy collection of hand tools, each one cleaned, lightly oiled, and arranged with almost obsessive precision. Every screwdriver rested in order from smallest to largest. Wrenches hung in perfectly matched rows. Even a handful of spare bolts had been sorted into little glass jars according to size. Owen smiled with genuine appreciation. "Whoever maintained this place," he murmured, "I wish I'd met you." He closed the cabinet exactly as he'd found it and continued on his way, never realizing the careful arrangement wasn't 50 years old. It had been finished less than 3 nights earlier. When the station lights dimmed that evening, another routine quietly began beneath the one Owen believed he knew. The little figure waited until she heard the familiar creak of his cabin door closing before slipping silently through the maintenance passages with a cloth satchel hanging from one shoulder. She knew his schedule already. He always read for a little while before sleeping. He always left one corridor light burning outside his cabin because the switch beside the galley occasionally stuck. He always hummed the same half-forgotten melody while washing dishes, though never quite the same way, twice. For the first time in years, someone else's routine had become as familiar to her as her own, and she found herself smiling whenever she correctly guessed what he would do next. Tonight her destination wasn't the galley, but the little workshop Owen had claimed near the forward cargo bay. She eased the door open just enough to slip inside and stood quietly looking around. The room had changed so much in only a few days that it scarcely resembled the dusty compartment she remembered. Shelves had been repaired, broken lights replaced, tools hung from fresh pegboards outlined carefully in black paint. She walked slowly along the workbench, running one fingertip across the smooth wooden surface before stopping beside a small pile of socket wrenches Owen hadn't yet sorted. Without really thinking about it, she began arranging them by size. It was simply the way she'd been taught. Big to small, metric separate from standard, frequently used tools closest to the edge of the bench. By the time she finished, the cluttered pile had become an orderly row. She stepped back, nodded once in quiet satisfaction, then froze. Footsteps, very faint, somewhere in the corridor outside. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she extinguished her flashlight and disappeared behind the workshop door just seconds before Owen wandered sleepily inside, wearing slippers and carrying an empty coffee mug. He blinked in surprise when he reached the workbench. "I don't remember doing that," he said quietly to himself, looking at the neatly organized sockets. For several moments he simply stood there, trying to decide whether fatigue had finally begun affecting his memory more than he cared to admit. He honestly couldn't remember putting them away. Yet there they were, arranged exactly as he would have done it himself, perhaps even a little better. Owen chuckled softly, picked up the smallest wrench to admire the arrangement, and shook his head. "Maybe you're finally learning to clean up after yourself." He switched off the workshop light, still smiling, and headed back toward his cabin. Hidden in the darkness only a few feet away, the little girl remained perfectly still until the sound of his footsteps faded. Only then did she allow herself to breathe again. For the first time since the stranger had moved aboard her ship, she realized something unexpected. He wasn't making it feel less like home. Little by little, he was making it feel like home again. The following week settled into a pattern that neither of them fully understood, though each noticed the subtle changes in the other. Owen found himself smiling more often for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He no longer hurried through dinner before collapsing into bed, instead lingering over coffee while sketching ideas for future repairs in a worn engineering notebook. Every evening, another little improvement greeted him. A storage drawer he'd forgotten to tighten no longer rattled. A squeaky hinge had somehow fallen silent. One morning, he discovered the broom already hanging neatly inside the cleaning closet after distinctly remembering leaving it against the galley wall the night before. None of it felt alarming. If anything, it felt thoughtful, like living in a house where someone else quietly finished the chores you forgot. His logical mind still searched for ordinary explanations. Fatigue remained the leading suspect, followed closely by habit. He was building routines now, and routines often disappeared from conscious memory. Yet one small detail continued bothering him. Whoever, or whatever, kept putting things away always chose the sensible place. Never somewhere random, never somewhere confusing. Always exactly where an experienced mechanic would expect to find them. That suggested intention, and intention required someone thinking about his work the same way he did. The thought lingered in the back of his mind long after he'd convinced himself to ignore it. For the first time since buying the hearth fire, Owen decided to test that idea. It wasn't an investigation so much as a quiet experiment born from curiosity. Late Thursday evening, he carried a box of assorted bolts into the workshop and deliberately left it sitting open in the middle of the bench. Beside it, he placed 3 socket wrenches out of order, a screwdriver balanced awkwardly across the edge of the vise, and his tape measure lying half open on the floor where no mechanic would intentionally leave it. He stood back, studying the deliberately untidy scene, then laughed at himself. "You're conducting experiments on your own memory now," he muttered. It felt ridiculous, but he left everything exactly where it was before heading to bed. When he returned after work the following afternoon, he stopped in the doorway without taking another step. Every tool rested precisely where it belonged. The sockets hung on the pegboard in perfect sequence. The tape measure had been rewound and clipped onto the side of the workbench. The open box of bolts had been sorted into separate trays according to size, thread, and length with a level of patience Owen doubted he would have shown himself. He slowly walked to the bench, lifted one tray, then another. Whoever had done the work knew exactly what they were looking at. These weren't random piles. Fine thread machine bolts had been separated from coarse structural fasteners. Stainless steel had been divided from ordinary carbon steel. Even damaged pieces had been placed in their own little container for recycling. Owen leaned against the workbench for nearly a minute without speaking. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't even particularly surprised. Mostly he was impressed. "Well," he said quietly into the empty room, "whoever you are, you've got better organizational skills than half the mechanics I work with." The workshop answered only with silence. Hidden beyond two bulkheads in a maintenance crawl space no wider than an air duct, the little girl sat perfectly still with both hands pressed over her mouth. She had heard every word through the ventilation grill. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. For nearly 6 years, every lesson had revolved around one simple rule: never let anyone know you're here. Her mother had repeated it until illness stole the strength from her voice. After that, the rule had become something even stronger than memory. It became survival. Yet the new man aboard the ship didn't behave like the people her mother had warned her about. He didn't smash things when they broke. He repaired them. He didn't shout into empty corridors. He said thank you when he found old maintenance notes written by mechanics who had probably died years before. He polished brass plaques nobody else would ever notice. He even apologized to the ship whenever he accidentally scratched freshly painted walls while carrying lumber through the corridors. None of it made sense. She had watched scavengers strip equipment from abandoned compartments, inspectors pry open lockers looking for valuables, security officers sweep ships with flashlights and leave muddy footprints everywhere. Owen was nothing like them. He spoke to empty rooms as though someone deserved to hear him. Worse still, he had started leaving things unfinished. The scattered tools hadn't been an accident. She knew that now. It had been a test, and she'd walked straight into it without realizing. Sitting alone in the darkness, she wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to decide whether she'd made a terrible mistake. Owen didn't touch the neatly organized hardware for the rest of the evening. Instead, he made himself dinner, carried his plate to the galley table, and thought about the workshop while absent-mindedly stirring a bowl of stew. There were only 3 possibilities, and 2 of them were ridiculous. Either he had somehow organized the entire bench himself without remembering a single moment of it. Someone from the station had been entering his ship while he was at work. Or he stopped himself before finishing the thought. The third explanation sounded impossible. Even so, he found himself replaying dozens of little moments from the past 2 weeks. The missing corner of the bread, the toolbox moved out of the corridor, the spotless workshop cabinet, the folded newspaper, the perfectly watered fern that always seemed healthier than he remembered leaving it. Separately, every incident had been easy to dismiss. Together they formed a pattern his mechanic's mind could no longer ignore. Patterns mattered. Machines failed in patterns. Electrical faults appeared in patterns. Good diagnostics began by accepting that coincidence eventually stopped being coincidence. Owen looked around the warm galley, his eyes drifting toward the little wooden shuttle resting on the windowsill. Then, very deliberately, he rose from his chair, sliced 2 thick pieces from the fresh loaf of bread, cooling on the counter, spread butter across both while they were still warm, and placed them on a clean plate beside a mug of hot tea. He carried the little meal into the workshop, set it carefully in the middle of the freshly organized bench, and tucked a folded note beneath the edge of the plate. The note contained only 6 handwritten words. "Thank you for helping with the ship. Nothing more. No accusations. No questions. No demand for whoever had been hiding to reveal themselves." Then Owen switched off the workshop light, closed the door behind him, and walked away. The workshop remained exactly as Owen had left it until he returned from work the following evening, though only at first glance. His socket set, which he had intentionally scattered across the bench, now hung neatly on the pegboard in perfect order. Every loose bolt had been sorted into shallow trays by size, thread, and material. The tape measure he had left half open lay fully rewound beside the vise, while the screwdriver balanced carelessly across the edge of the bench now rested inside its painted outline, as though it had never been misplaced. Owen quietly closed the workshop door behind him and stood without moving. He wasn't smiling this time, nor was he unsettled. Instead, he examined the arrangement with the same patient concentration he brought to diagnosing stubborn engines. Whoever had done this wasn't simply tidy. They understood the work. Damaged fasteners had been separated from usable ones. Stainless hardware had been divided from ordinary steel so it wouldn't corrode. The sockets weren't arranged by size alone, but by the order a mechanic naturally reached for them during a repair. Owen picked up one tray, turned it slowly in his hands, then returned it to exactly the same spot. He looked around the empty room as if expecting the walls themselves to answer. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Only the steady murmur of the ventilation replied. After another moment, he smiled to himself. "I've worked with mechanics who weren't this organized." The compliment disappeared into the silence before he switched on the workbench light and spent the next hour rebuilding an old hydraulic pump, deliberately forcing himself not to think about who might be listening. Hidden beyond two bulkheads and a maintenance shaft too narrow for most adults to enter, the little girl sat with her knees drawn tightly against her chest, listening through a narrow air vent that overlooked the workshop. She hadn't meant to betray herself. When she'd found the scattered tools the night before, she'd assumed he'd simply been too tired to finish cleaning up after work. Leaving tools lying around had never been allowed aboard the hearth fire. Her mother had drilled that lesson into her almost as soon as she could walk. Loose wrenches rolled beneath machinery. Missing screwdrivers delayed repairs. Disorder wasted precious time when something important broke. Cleaning up wasn't a chore, it was part of surviving. She hadn't stopped to wonder why a man as careful as Owen Hale would suddenly leave an entire workbench in disarray. Now, listening to him quietly inspect every tray she'd organized, she realized too late that the mess hadn't been an accident at all. He had noticed the strange little changes that followed him through the ship. Worse, he was beginning to understand they weren't coincidences. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for angry footsteps, for shouted demands, for station security to arrive, with bright lights and questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she heard only the soft scrape of a wrench against steel as Owen returned it to the tray, followed by his gentle laugh and the unexpected compliment that echoed through the ventilation duct. She opened her eyes in surprise. No one had ever sounded grateful because she'd cleaned something before. She remained hidden long after his footsteps faded away, replaying those few quiet words over and over in her mind until they became almost impossible to forget. The following days brought a strange sort of unspoken conversation between two people who had still never seen one another. Owen found himself becoming less interested in solving the mystery than understanding it. Every evening, another tiny act of kindness appeared somewhere aboard the ship. The rag he had forgotten beside an engine compartment would be washed and folded over the sink. Empty boxes vanished from the corridor after he carried replacement parts into storage. A cabinet door that had always drifted open somehow stayed shut because someone had quietly tightened the hinge while he slept. None of it felt threatening. In fact, he slowly realized that whoever shared the hearth fire seemed to spend an extraordinary amount of effort making his life just a little easier. He decided against setting traps or searching the maintenance passages. If someone wanted to remain hidden that badly, there was probably a reason. Instead, curiosity got the better of him in gentler ways. Before leaving for work one morning, he intentionally placed a single wrench crooked across the center of the workbench rather than hanging it on its hook. It wasn't much of an experiment, more like a question asked without words. Then he locked the workshop, shouldered his tool bag, and headed for Bay 12. That night, the girl stood silently in the workshop doorway for several long minutes without crossing the threshold. The lonely wrench rested exactly where Owen had left it, angled awkwardly across the polished steel surface. Every instinct she possessed urged her to put it away. It would take less than 2 seconds. She knew precisely where it belonged without even looking at the pegboard. Her hand lifted almost on its own before stopping halfway through the motion. What if he had left it there on purpose? What if moving it would tell him she'd been there again? She stared at the wrench until her arm slowly fell back to her side. It was the untidiest thing she had seen anywhere aboard the ship since Owen began restoring it, and leaving it there made her strangely uncomfortable. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she turned away and disappeared back into the hidden passages beneath the deck. The wrench remained exactly where it was. The next afternoon, Owen returned from work, stepped into the workshop, and immediately noticed it hadn't moved. He looked at the untouched tool for a long moment before quietly nodding to himself. Whoever was helping him had noticed the question. They had simply chosen not to answer it. Rather than feeling disappointed, Owen found himself smiling. Somewhere aboard the old freighter lived a person thoughtful enough to organize an entire workshop and careful enough to know when not to. For the first time since buying the Hearthfire, the ship no longer felt abandoned. It felt shared. Neither of them was ready to admit it yet, but without exchanging a single word, they had already begun learning how to trust one another. As summer on the station gave way to another maintenance season, the Hearthfire slowly shed the feeling of an abandoned hulk and began resembling a ship that had merely been sleeping. Owen kept his promise to himself not to go hunting through the hidden spaces. Whatever mystery lived aboard with him had earned at least that much respect. Instead, he devoted his evenings to the long list of repairs that still waited patiently for capable hands. The bridge received its first working navigation display after years of darkness. The galley's ancient refrigeration unit groaned back to life beneath a collection of salvaged relays and rebuilt compressors. A pair of crew cabins became clean enough that he finally removed the faded unsafe for occupancy tags inspectors had left hanging from their doors a decade earlier. He talked while he worked, not because he expected anyone to answer, but because silence no longer felt necessary. Sometimes he explained what he was fixing, as though teaching an apprentice. Other times he simply muttered observations to himself. If whoever designed this junction box is still alive, he grumbled one evening while wedged shoulder-deep behind an electrical cabinet, I owe them a strongly worded letter. A few seconds later, he laughed at his own joke before finally pulling the stubborn panel free. Somewhere beyond the bulkhead, hidden where he couldn't possibly see, another laugh escaped before it could be stopped. It was quiet, barely more than an involuntary breath, but it froze both of them. Owen slowly looked over his shoulder toward the empty quarter. The sound had vanished so quickly he couldn't honestly say whether he'd imagined it. After another moment, he smiled faintly and returned to his wiring. Guess I'm getting lonely enough to hear ghosts now. The little girl remained absolutely motionless inside the maintenance passage, one hand clamped tightly over her mouth, while her heart pounded so hard she could feel it against the cold steel beneath her. She had never laughed while watching him before. She hadn't meant to now. It had simply escaped. For several long minutes she didn't dare move, convinced he would begin pulling access panels off the walls until he found her. Instead, she heard tools clicking together again as Owen resumed working exactly where he'd left off. Relief washed through her so suddenly that she had to sit down. He hadn't searched. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't called station security. More confusing still, he hadn't sounded angry. Slowly, almost without realizing it, she began listening again. Owen had started explaining the wiring diagram aloud, tracing circuits with the tip of his screwdriver while describing why the previous repair had failed. She found herself following every word. Much of it she already understood from years of keeping the ship barely alive with scavenged parts. But sometimes he explained things her mother had never known. Why a relay should be mounted farther from a heat source. Why one alloy corroded faster beside another. Why replacing a failed component without finding the reason it failed simply guaranteed another breakdown later. She stayed hidden until he finally packed away his tools for the night, quietly repeating his explanations to herself until she could remember them without thinking. A few evenings later, Owen decided to tackle the neglected hydroponics bay near the stern of the ship. According to the original blueprints, it had once supplied fresh vegetables for crews spending months away from settled space, though every inspection report he'd read described it as beyond recovery. The heavy hatch protested loudly before finally swinging inward on rusted hinges, releasing the stale scent of old soil and dormant machinery. Rows of cracked, growing beds stretched beneath dusty light panels, while brittle vines hung from overhead supports like forgotten decorations. Owen walked slowly between them, making notes in his notebook as he went. The irrigation pumps would need rebuilding. Half the nutrient lines had split from age. Most of the lighting assemblies were probably salvage at best. Then he stopped beside the center planter. Nestled among the dead roots stood 3 tiny green shoots no taller than his finger, reaching determinedly toward the faint light spilling through the doorway. He crouched for a closer look, gently brushing away loose soil. They were healthy, recently watered, not surviving by accident, but cared for. Owen looked around the vast room again, seeing it differently now. A watering can rested beneath one bench with fresh mineral stains around the spout. Several empty nutrient containers had been stacked neatly against the far wall instead of scattered randomly. Someone had been here. Not years ago. Recently. Very recently. He looked down at the little plants and smiled despite the 1,000 new questions forming in his mind. "Well," he said softly, "I guess I'm not the only one trying to bring this old ship back." Hidden above the hydroponics bay, the little girl watched through a narrow service grate with dirt still beneath her fingernails. Those 3 plants had taken months to coax back to life after finding a handful of viable seeds sealed inside an emergency supply locker. She had almost harvested them the week before, but something had stopped her. Perhaps she simply wanted to see green growing aboard the hearthfire again. Perhaps she was tired of every room looking abandoned. She hadn't expected Owen to find them so soon. When he knelt beside the planter instead of pulling the seedlings out, something inside her relaxed. He examined the leaves with the same care he gave every machine he repaired, then spent the next hour cleaning debris from the irrigation channels without disturbing a single fragile stem. Before leaving, he filled an old bucket with fresh water from the restored plumbing system and poured it carefully into the growing bed until the dry soil darkened around the little plants. "There," he said with quiet satisfaction, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can't have you doing all the work by yourselves." After the hatch closed behind him, the girl remained where she was for several minutes, staring at the damp soil below. Then, for the first time since Owen had come aboard, she climbed down into the room before he had even gone to sleep. She knelt beside the planter, touched one of the tiny leaves with surprising gentleness, and discovered the bucket beside it was still half full. Without thinking, she smiled. It wasn't her garden anymore. Somehow, without either of them ever agreeing to it, it had become theirs. Weeks slipped quietly into months, and the hearthfire settled into a rhythm neither of its residents had planned. Owen worked his shifts at Bay 12, stopping by surplus markets whenever he found a bargain worth carrying home, while every evening another forgotten corner of the old freighter slowly came back to life beneath his hands. The bridge windows became clear enough to watch freighters drift through the docking ring. Warm light replaced the harsh, amber emergency fixtures throughout the forward decks. The galley no longer echoed like an abandoned warehouse. Once shelves held dishes, a battered coffee tin, and a small radio that played old station broadcasts while he cooked. More than once, he caught himself referring to the ship as "we" instead of "I." "We'll get that engine room cleaned up next weekend. We'll finally have the water heaters running before winter." Each time the words slipped out, he smiled without really noticing. The invisible helper had become part of his thinking. He still had no idea who they were, but every morning brought quiet evidence that someone else cared just as deeply about the ship as he did. The broom always found its way back to the cleaning closet after he forgot it. Empty paint cans disappeared before he could haul them to recycling. Fresh rags appeared folded beside whatever project he happened to be working on that evening. It was never enough to feel impossible, just enough to make living aboard the hearthfire feel strangely shared. For the girl, life had become far more complicated than it had been before Owen arrived. Hiding had once been simple because everyone who stepped aboard eventually left again. Inspectors came for a few hours. Salvage crews stayed a day or two. Security officers walked the main corridors, declared the ship empty, and moved on. Owen never left. Worse still, he kept making the ship warmer, brighter, and quieter. Doors no longer screeched when opened. Cold drafts vanished as damaged seals were replaced. The leaking pipes she learned to avoid simply stopped leaking one by one. Even sleeping became easier, because she no longer had to wake every few hours to check whether another failing pump had finally given up. She found herself with something she'd never really had before: time. Sometimes she spent it following Owen through the maintenance passages, watching him solve problems her mother had never figured out. Other nights she wandered restored sections of the ship simply because she could. She liked sitting on the bridge after Owen went to bed, looking through windows that had become transparent again instead of cloudy with age. She liked hearing music drift through the ventilation while he cooked dinner below. Most of all, she liked that the ship had begun sounding alive again. Machinery hummed where silence used to linger. Water flowed through pipes instead of dripping into buckets. For the first time since losing her mother, the hearthfire no longer felt like a place slowly dying around her. It felt as though it wanted to live. One Saturday afternoon, Owen rolled open the heavy doors leading into the ship's recreation room, expecting another dusty storage compartment. Instead, he found rows of overturned tables, shelves filled with warped board games, and a large projection screen covering the forward wall. Most of the furniture was salvageable, though years of neglect had left everything coated in grime. "Well," he said, setting down his toolbox, "looks like you've been waiting for somebody to clean this place up." The project occupied nearly the entire day. Broken tables were repaired instead of discarded. Windows were washed until station light poured into the room. The old projector took almost 3 frustrating hours before a replacement capacitor finally convinced it to power on, throwing a slightly crooked image across the screen. Owen couldn't help grinning when the manufacturer's logo flickered into view. "Still works," he said proudly. Before leaving for the evening, he arranged 2 comfortable chairs facing the screen, not because he expected company, but because the room somehow looked less empty that way. Then he forgot about it entirely. Hours later, after every light in his cabin had gone dark, the girl cautiously stepped inside. She had never seen the room illuminated before. During all the years she'd lived aboard the ship, the projector had been dead. The windows had been opaque with dust. She slowly crossed the room, running her fingers across one of the repaired tables, before settling carefully into the smaller of the 2 chairs. For several silent minutes, she simply looked around. Then she reached toward the projector controls, exactly as she'd watched Owen do earlier that afternoon. The machine hummed uncertainly before filling the screen with a faded recording from decades earlier. Crew members laughed around the very same room, celebrating someone's birthday, with paper decorations taped to the walls and far too much cake balanced on the tables Owen had repaired only hours before. She watched until the recording ended, then quietly rewound it and watched again. The following evening, Owen wandered into the recreation room carrying a mug of coffee, intending only to admire another completed project before bed. He stopped just inside the doorway. The chairs hadn't been where he'd left them. One had been moved several feet closer to the screen. The projector, which he'd shut down the night before, sat warm beneath his fingertips. Someone had used it recently. He glanced toward the screen where the old birthday recording remained, paused halfway through a smiling crew member, blowing out candles while friends applauded around him. Owen stood there for a long moment, coffee forgotten in his hand. He didn't wonder anymore whether another person lived aboard the hearthfire. He knew. More interestingly, he was beginning to learn who they were without ever seeing their face. They liked order. They cared for growing things. They understood machinery. And now apparently they watched old crew recordings late at night. He looked around the empty room, imagining someone sitting quietly in the chair nearest the screen after he'd gone to bed, and felt an unexpected ache settle in his chest. Whoever they were, they had been alone for a very long time. Without really thinking about it, he carried the second chair back beside the first instead of putting it away. This time he left the 2 seats close enough together that neither one felt isolated. Then he switched off the lights and headed toward his cabin, leaving the recreation room ready for 2 people instead of one. Hidden beyond the doorway until his footsteps disappeared, the girl waited several more minutes before stepping back inside. She noticed the chairs immediately. She looked from one to the other, then toward the empty corridor where Owen had vanished. For reasons she couldn't explain, she didn't move either of them. Instead, she sat down in the same chair she'd chosen the night before, letting the second remain beside her as another old recording filled the room with voices the hearthfire had not heard in many years. As autumn settled over the station, people slowly began noticing the transformation taking place aboard the hearthfire. Dock workers who had passed the abandoned freighter for years without a second glance found themselves slowing their cargo carts to admire freshly painted hull panels and warm light glowing behind windows that had once been black. Mechanics from Bay 12 started wandering over after their shifts carrying whatever useful odds and ends they had rescued from ships headed for scrap. One arrived with a pair of cabin doors that only needed refinishing. Another dropped off an unopened case of electrical fittings because, in his words, "They'll do more good over here than collecting dust in storage." Someone quietly left a crate of dishes outside the gangway one evening with no note attached, while another mechanic somehow found an old leather sofa that fit the recreation room almost perfectly after Owen spent half a day wrestling it through the cargo hatch. Owen protested every gift, insisting people could sell the parts instead. But nobody seemed interested in taking them back. They had all spent years watching the old freighter slowly decay against the station wall. Seeing someone treat her like she was worth saving had become strangely contagious. Before long, the hearth fire felt less like an impossible restoration and more like a community project that happened to belong to the quiet mechanic who refused to give up. Owen accepted every donation with genuine gratitude, carefully finding a place for each item before returning to whatever repair occupied that evening. The ship slowly began looking lived in rather than merely repaired. Fresh towels appeared in the washroom. Real dishes filled the galley cupboards instead of disposable plates. A faded rug softened the steel floor outside his cabin. More than once he caught himself standing in the middle of the corridor after work, simply looking around with quiet satisfaction, amazed that the cold shell he'd purchased only a few months earlier had begun feeling unmistakably like home. Yet alongside every improvement made by generous coworkers came the familiar, quieter touches from the unseen resident he still hadn't met. Empty boxes disappeared before he remembered taking them to recycling. Paintbrushes he left soaking overnight emerged perfectly clean the next morning. Fresh rags appeared folded beside whatever project he happened to be working on that evening. And every now and then, he noticed something repaired that he knew he hadn't fixed himself. A loose cabinet catch adjusted just enough to latch properly, a squeaking drawer runner suddenly moving without complaint, a loose screw tightened before it had worked itself completely free. Owen, no, not longer questioned whether someone else lived aboard the ship. The evidence had long since passed the point of coincidence. Oddly enough, he had stopped feeling curious in the anxious sense of the word. Instead, he found himself hoping whoever shared the hearth fire understood that he appreciated the help. He talked while he worked more than ever now, partly because decades of working alone had made it a habit, but also because silence no longer felt empty. He explained repairs aloud as though an apprentice stood beside him. "Never replace a failed part until you know why it failed," he remarked while rebuilding an electrical relay one evening. "Otherwise, you'll just be replacing it again next month." Another night, while rebuilding a circulation pump, he paused to wipe grease from his hands before adding, "Machines always tell you what's wrong. Most people just don't listen long enough." He never expected an answer, but hidden behind walls and beneath deck plates, another pair of ears absorbed every lesson. The little girl had learned almost everything she knew from watching her mother improvise impossible repairs with salvage parts and fading memories. Yet Owen filled in the gaps without ever realizing he had a student. She learned why dissimilar metals corroded when mounted together, why wiring should always be labeled before removing it, why forcing a stubborn bolt usually created two problems instead of one. Sometimes she practiced his methods later in hidden compartments he never entered, quietly repeating his explanations to herself until they became her own. The ship was teaching both of them in different ways. Owen was restoring her systems. The girl was slowly rediscovering something she'd nearly forgotten existed, what it felt like to learn from another person instead of simply surviving alone. By late October, only one major system still refused to cooperate before winter settled fully over the station: the hearth fire's central heating loop. Portable heaters kept Owen comfortable in the restored sections of the ship, but the deeper compartments where the girl still lived became painfully cold each night, forcing her to sleep wrapped beneath every blanket she owned. Owen attacked the problem with his usual patience, tracing coolant lines through forgotten service tunnels and replacing valves that hadn't moved in over a decade. The work forced him into maintenance spaces so cramped that every repair became an awkward puzzle of elbows, knees, and carefully chosen curse words muttered beneath his breath. More than once he laughed at the engineers who had designed the system. "You built this thing," he grumbled while squeezing through another access hatch, "then somehow forgot human shoulders exist." Hours passed before he finally reached the last seized circulation valve buried deep inside a narrow crawl space. Backing carefully toward the opening after freeing the assembly, he felt the familiar weight disappear from his belt as his flashlight slipped loose, bounced once against the deck, and rolled farther into the darkness than he could comfortably reach. Owen stretched after it, fingertips brushing the metal cylinder before it rolled another few inches beyond his grasp. He sighed, already debating whether he wanted to wedge himself completely inside the passage for a 5-second retrieval, when movement caught the corner of his eye. It was so small and so quick that he almost dismissed it as fatigue. Yet a heartbeat later, the flashlight rolled smoothly back across the steel floor until it stopped within easy reach of his hand. Owen didn't lunge forward. He didn't shine another light into the darkness or scramble deeper into the crawl space searching for whoever had helped him. Instead, he simply looked at the flashlight for a long moment, picked it up, clipped it calmly back onto his belt, and smiled into the darkness beyond the reach of the beam. "Thank you," he said in the same tone he might have used for a coworker, handing him the correct wrench. Then he turned back to the job. It took another half hour to finish rebuilding the valve, bleed the trapped air from the lines, and restart the circulation pumps. One by one, pipes that had remained cold for years began carrying warm coolant through forgotten sections of the ship. Owen watched the pressure gauges stabilize with quiet satisfaction before gathering his tools and sealing the access panel once again. As he reached for the compartment light switch, he hesitated just long enough to rest one grease-stained hand against the steel bulkhead beside the crawlspace. "I'll pretend I didn't see you," he said softly, "until you're ready." There was no reply, only the distant hum of warm water beginning its slow journey through the hearthfire's veins once more. Owen nodded once, switched off the lights and walked away without looking back. Hidden only a few meters beyond the sealed passage, the little girl remained frozen where she knelt, one hand still resting against the pipe that had finally begun growing warm beneath her fingertips. She had broken the oldest rule her mother had ever taught her the moment she rolled that flashlight back across the floor. For years, she had believed discovery would mean losing everything. Instead, the man repairing her ship had accepted the smallest kindness she could offer, thanked her without demanding anything in return, restored heat to the forgotten corners where she still slept, and left the choice entirely in her hands. Long after his footsteps faded into the distance, she sat quietly in the comforting warmth spreading through the pipes, realizing that for the first time since she had become alone aboard the hearthfire, the future no longer felt quite so frightening. Winter announced itself with a thin layer of frost spreading across the station's outer observation windows, though aboard the hearthfire the change felt far less severe than it might have only a few weeks earlier. Warm coolant now flowed steadily through pipes that had sat dormant for over a decade, filling once-forgotten corridors with gentle heat that lingered long after Owen switched off his workshop lights each evening. He noticed the difference immediately. Mornings no longer began with icy metal beneath his bare feet, and the galley stayed warm enough that his coffee remained steaming long after breakfast. What he didn't know was that the restored heating had transformed another part of the ship entirely. Deep inside the maintenance passages, where the little girl had spent years sleeping beneath piles of scavenged blankets, the walls were finally warm enough to lean against without flinching. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept through an entire night without waking from the cold. The simple comfort unsettled her almost as much as it delighted her. She had grown so accustomed to surviving that comfort itself felt unfamiliar. Owen's evenings gradually settled into routines that somehow included another person without ever requiring them to meet. He would finish dinner, wash the dishes, and leave the drying rack exactly where it was instead of putting everything away immediately. By morning, every plate and mug would already be stacked neatly inside the cupboards. If he carried lumber through the forward corridor and left a trail of sawdust behind, it would quietly disappear overnight. Once, after spending nearly an hour searching for a replacement gasket he'd been certain he'd purchased weeks earlier, he returned to the workshop to find it sitting neatly on top of the repair manual open to the exact page describing its installation. He laughed out loud when he saw it. "I owe you one," he said to the empty room before finishing the repair. He still never looked behind access panels or searched the hidden spaces between the walls. Instead, he accepted each quiet kindness with the same natural gratitude he would have shown any friend lending a hand. The invisible conversation continued in its own peculiar language. Owen fixed what the ship needed to survive. The unseen helper quietly took care of Owen. The girl found herself watching him less out of caution now and more out of simple curiosity. She learned that he never skipped breakfast, no matter how late he worked the night before. He always carried two pencils because one inevitably disappeared somewhere inside an engine compartment. Whenever a repair refused to cooperate, he sat down with a cup of coffee rather than forcing the problem, insisting to nobody in particular that thinking usually weighs less than swinging a bigger hammer. Sometimes she caught herself smiling before she realized she was doing it. The ship no longer echoed with lonely footsteps. It echoed with Owen humming old songs while repainting bulkheads or whistling softly as he sorted hardware in the workshop. She had begun recognizing those tunes well enough to know when he was in a particularly good mood. One evening, she even found herself humming one absent-mindedly while tending the little hydroponics garden. The sound stopped her cold. She hadn't hummed anything since her mother died. Standing alone beneath the grow lights, she rested one hand against the nearest planter, surprised by how much had changed without her noticing. Months earlier, she'd hidden because every stranger represented danger. Now she hid because she no longer knew how to stop. A few days before the station's annual winter market, Owen returned from work carrying far more bags than usual. Most contained ordinary supplies: paint rollers, replacement filters, fresh coffee. But tucked awkwardly beneath one arm was a small artificial pine tree, no taller than his waist, its branches slightly bent from years in someone's storage locker. He set it in the middle of the galley, stepped back, and scratched thoughtfully at his chin. "Well," he said with a grin, "you've seen better days, but I suppose that makes two of us." The tree needed a little attention before it resembled anything festive. Several branches had to be straightened by hand, and the cheap plastic stand leaned noticeably to one side until Owen slipped a folded piece of cardboard beneath one leg. Satisfied with the result, he unpacked a box of mismatched ornaments he'd found at the market for almost nothing. There were shiny silver spheres missing their paint, little wooden stars carved by hand, faded ribbons, and an old brass bell with a cracked clapper that no longer rang. Owen hung each one carefully, smiling now and then as forgotten memories surfaced. "My mother always insisted the ugliest ornaments had the best stories," he murmured while hanging a crooked wooden snowflake near the top. When the tree was finished, he plugged in a short strand of warm white lights. Half the bulbs refused to work. He sighed dramatically, laughed at himself, replaced two fuses from his toolbox, and watched the entire tree spring gently to life. It wasn't particularly impressive. It leaned slightly to the left, the decorations didn't match, and one branch stubbornly pointed straight toward the ceiling, no matter how often he bent it back into place. Even so, the little tree transformed the galley. The warm lights reflected softly from polished cupboards and freshly painted walls, making the room feel less like a ship and more like someone's home. Owen stood admiring it for another minute before setting a wrapped package beneath the lowest branch. The parcel was small, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with blue string. Anyone would have assumed it was waiting for a friend or relative to visit during the holiday. Late that night, after Owen had fallen asleep in his cabin with a book resting open across his chest, the little girl emerged from the hidden passages as she had done countless times before. She stopped the instant she reached the galley doorway. The tree glowed quietly in the darkness, filling the room with warm pools of light unlike anything she'd ever seen aboard the hearth fire. She stepped closer, moving so slowly that the deck scarcely creaked beneath her feet. The ornaments fascinated her. She turned the cracked brass bell gently between her fingers before carefully placing it back exactly where she'd found it. The wooden stars smelled faintly of cedar. Tiny reflections danced across the polished silver ornaments whenever the lights flickered. Finally, her attention settled on the lone package resting beneath the branches. She knelt beside it, reading the small handwritten tag attached to the string. "For whoever keeps helping me." She stared at the words until the lights blurred. No name, no demand that she reveal herself. Just a gift left beneath a crooked little tree by a man who somehow seemed to understand that trust, like restoring an old ship, couldn't be rushed. Slowly, almost afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly, she reached out and rested trembling fingertips against the neatly wrapped package without opening it, wondering if she had ever received a present before in her entire life. The little package remained beneath the tree for 3 days. Owen never mentioned it, never glanced toward it with obvious expectation, and never moved it while sweeping the galley floor or wiping dust from the shelves. If the unseen resident chose to ignore it forever, then that would simply be her choice. Life aboard the hearth fire continued much as it always had. He left before sunrise for Bay 12, spent long days repairing engines that younger mechanics insisted belonged in scrap yards, then returned home carrying another small improvement tucked beneath one arm. One evening, it was a battered bookshelf rescued from an office renovation. Another day, he arrived with a brass wall clock that refused to keep time until an hour at the workbench convinced it otherwise. A retired electrician donated a reading lamp that cast a warm pool of light over the galley table. Someone else left a thick wool blanket outside the gangway with a note that simply read, "Too nice to throw away." Owen found a place for every gift. The galley cupboards slowly filled with real dishes instead of disposable plates. The recreation room gained books, comfortable blankets, and an old chess set missing only a single pawn. Outside his cabin, he hung several framed photographs of the hearth fire taken decades earlier when her paint still gleamed beneath distant suns, and cargo crews leaned proudly against freshly polished railings. Sometimes, after finishing another repair, he stood quietly comparing those photographs to the corridor surrounding him, smiling at how much of that old ship had already returned. More than once he found himself speaking softly to the empty room. "We'll get you there," he'd say while tightening the final screw on another cabinet door. "One job at a time." The little acts of kindness from his unseen helper never stopped either. Fresh towels appeared folded before he remembered washing them. The hydroponics beds somehow remained healthier than his schedule should have allowed. Tools left out after particularly exhausting evenings quietly found their way home before morning. Owen accepted every small favor with the same simple gratitude he would have shown a coworker handing him the right wrench. Sometimes that gratitude amounted to nothing more than a quiet "thank you" spoken into an empty workshop before he carried on with his evening. He never searched the maintenance passages or pried open hidden access panels, hoping to force a meeting. Whoever shared the hearth fire had made it clear they weren't ready, and after all these weeks, Owen had come to understand that trust couldn't be repaired with bigger tools or clever tricks. Like everything else aboard the old freighter, it would come together one careful piece at a time. For the girl, the little parcel beneath the crooked tree slowly became impossible to ignore. Nearly every night she slipped into the galley after Owen had fallen asleep, standing just outside the warm circle of light cast by the repaired string of holiday bulbs. She would study the carefully wrapped package for several quiet minutes before kneeling beside it and lifting it gently into her hands. It weighed almost nothing. Sometimes she turned it over, tracing the neat folds in the brown paper with one fingertip. More than once she slipped a nail beneath the blue string, only to stop before loosening the knot. Gifts were confusing. The few she remembered from childhood had always come from her mother, accompanied by laughter, stories, or warm hugs that still felt painfully distant whenever she tried to remember them. This gift had come from someone who didn't even know her name. Every instinct she'd relied on for years whispered that accepting kindness meant becoming visible, and becoming visible meant risking everything. So each night she carefully placed the parcel back beneath the tree exactly where she'd found it before disappearing into the hidden passages once again. Even without opening it, however, she discovered herself thinking about Owen more often than she intended. She listened to him humming while repairing pumps, smiled whenever he congratulated himself after finally solving a particularly stubborn problem, and quietly repeated the little lessons he spoke aloud while working until she knew them by heart. One evening she realized she had been humming one of those same tunes while tending the hydroponics garden and stopped in surprise, the sound fading into the warm air around the growing beds. It had been years since she'd made music without thinking about it. Owen wasn't simply restoring the hearth fire anymore. Without either of them noticing exactly when it had happened, he had begun repairing the silence that had settled over the ship after so many lonely years. Finally, on the fourth night, she carried the little package back to her hidden room beneath the engineering deck. She sat on the narrow cot her mother had built from spare cargo pallets, turning it over in her hands for a long time before gently pulling the blue string free. Inside, wrapped in a clean shop rag, rested a brand new pocket flashlight. It wasn't expensive or especially powerful, but its polished aluminum body shone beneath the dim lantern hanging from the ceiling, and when she pressed the switch, a steady beam filled the little room with bright white light instead of the weak yellow glow she'd relied on for years. Tucked beneath the flashlight lay a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly and found only one sentence written in Owen's careful block letters. "Every mechanic deserves a good flashlight." She stared at those words until they blurred, then laughed quietly through tears she hadn't expected, clutching the little light against her chest before wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her oversized jacket. Long after the flashlight had been switched off, she remained sitting on the edge of her bed, with a note resting carefully beside her, wondering how someone who had never even seen her could understand exactly what she needed. The next morning, Owen wandered into the galley with his usual cup of coffee and noticed immediately that the space beneath the tree was empty. He smiled to himself, but deliberately looked away, refusing to search for clues or signs that the gift had been opened. He made breakfast, listened to the old brass clock ticking steadily on the wall, and settled into his usual chair before finally noticing something resting beside his plate. The brown wrapping paper had been folded into a remarkably neat square, the same blue string wrapped carefully around it exactly as before. Sitting on top was a tiny wooden bird, no larger than his thumb. Its carving wasn't perfect. One wing leaned slightly lower than the other, and careful inspection revealed an old repair where the tail had once broken and been glued back into place. Even so, Owen could see immediately that someone had spent hours shaping it with simple hand tools and even more hours preserving it afterward. It wasn't an expensive gift. It was something far rarer. It was something that had belonged to someone with almost nothing, yet they had chosen to share it anyway. Owen turned the little bird gently between his fingers before looking around the quiet galley with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Without speaking, he carried the carving to the shelf above the brass clock and placed it where it caught the morning light spilling through the window. Then he stepped back, admired it for a moment, poured himself another cup of coffee, and continued his morning exactly as always. He never said thank you out loud this time. Somehow he had the feeling the little bird already was. Winter settled comfortably over the station after that, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of shorter days and longer evenings. Outside, frost traced delicate patterns across observation windows, while cargo tugs drifted through clouds of crystallized vapor between docking rings. Inside the hearth fire, however, warmth had become something ordinary. The restored heating system hummed faithfully through the walls. The galley always smelled faintly of fresh coffee and machine oil, and every evening the little brass clock ticked steadily above the shelf where the tiny wooden bird now stood beside it. Owen smiled whenever he noticed it, though he never lingered long enough to make a ceremony of the gift. That he suspected would embarrass whoever had left it. Instead, he simply dusted around it whenever he cleaned the shelf, making certain it always remained where the morning light caught its carved wings. In return, small kindnesses continued appearing throughout the ship as naturally as breathing. A stack of repair manuals he'd been meaning to organize suddenly appeared arranged by system instead of publication date, making them far easier to use. The old sofa in the recreation room acquired a neatly folded blanket after Owen mentioned aloud one evening that the room always seemed colder than the rest of the ship. A loose button disappeared from his favorite work jacket, only to reappear the next morning, sewn back into place, with sturdy black thread that looked far better than anything he could have managed himself. None of these things surprised him anymore. They simply became part of life aboard the hearth fire. Two people quietly caring for the same home, in different ways. Sometimes while working late into the evening, Owen found himself pausing in the middle of a repair to explain something that probably didn't need explaining. "Never over-tighten brass fittings," he remarked while rebuilding a water manifold. "They'll let you think they're happy right up until they crack." Another evening, while adjusting cabinet doors in the galley, he chuckled to himself and added, "Measure twice, cut once. Ignore that rule and you'll spend the rest of the afternoon pretending you meant to make firewood." He had no audience he could see, yet talking had become strangely comforting. Behind the walls, the girl listened to every lesson as faithfully as any apprentice, practicing them later in hidden compartments until she could repeat them without hesitation. More surprising than the lessons themselves were the stories that occasionally slipped out while Owen worked. He spoke about the first engine he'd rebuilt with his father, when he was barely tall enough to reach the workbench, about the supervisor who insisted every mechanic should know how to sharpen a pencil with a pocket knife before learning to use a torque wrench, and about the elderly freighter captain who had once paid him with homemade pie because his company had gone bankrupt before settling the repair bill. Those stories painted a picture of a world far larger than the station itself, a world filled with ordinary people helping one another simply because it was the decent thing to do. The girl found herself waiting for them almost as eagerly as the engineering lessons. One Saturday afternoon, Owen decided the hearth fire deserved something she'd been missing for far too long: a proper kitchen. The old galley already functioned well enough for one person, but decades of mismatched cabinets and empty shelves still made it feel temporary. Armed with reclaimed lumber, a handful of salvaged hinges, and more enthusiasm than good sense, he spent the day building sturdy open shelving along one wall, carefully sanding each board until the wood felt smooth beneath his fingertips before rubbing it with warm oil that brought out the grain. By evening, the shelves held jars of flour, rice, pasta, dried beans, tea, coffee, and neatly labeled tins of herbs collected over several shopping trips. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing ingredients instead of empty space. Owen stepped back, folded his arms, and nodded with quiet approval. "Now," he announced to the otherwise empty galley, "this finally looks like somebody actually lives here." He celebrated by baking bread, something he attempted only a few times each winter because it always reminded him of home. The dough refused to cooperate at first, clinging stubbornly to the countertop until more flour solved the argument. The first loaf came out a little too dark on one side after he became distracted, replacing a faulty light switch halfway through baking. The second emerged golden, warm, and fragrant enough to fill the entire forward section of the ship with the smell of fresh bread. Owen laughed at the uneven pair, sliced the darker loaf while it was still steaming, spread butter across a thick piece, and declared it perfectly acceptable despite appearances. After dinner, he wrapped the untouched loaf in a clean towel and placed it on the highest shelf before heading to bed, already planning to make sandwiches from it over the next several days. Long after the ship had fallen quiet, the girl stepped cautiously into the galley carrying the little flashlight Owen had given her, tucked safely inside one pocket. She still used her old dim lantern inside the maintenance passages, almost out of habit, but whenever she ventured into restored sections of the ship, she found herself reaching instinctively for the bright new light instead. It illuminated details she'd never noticed before: the rich color of the wooden shelves Owen had built, tiny scratches in the polished countertop left by years of ordinary meals, the handwritten labels on jars lined up with almost comical precision. She smiled when she saw the two loaves of bread, immediately recognizing which one Owen had considered imperfect by the way it had already been cut. Her mother had always claimed the ugliest loaves tasted the best because they spent less time being admired and more time being eaten. The memory made her laugh softly under her breath. She reached toward the untouched loaf on the upper shelf, hesitated, then withdrew her hand. It wasn't hers. Instead, she tore a small piece from the darker loaf Owen had already started, exactly as she had done months earlier with that very first loaf of bread. Sitting quietly at the galley table beneath a warm light, she ate slowly, savoring every bite while absent-mindedly looking around the room that had become so different from the abandoned space she remembered. Without thinking, she brushed a few crumbs from the table into her hand before wiping the surface clean with a folded cloth she found hanging beside the sink. As she stood to leave, her eyes settled on the little wooden bird displayed proudly beside the brass clock. Owen hadn't tucked it away in a drawer or placed it somewhere private. He had given it a place of honor where anyone entering the room would notice it immediately. She stood there for several long moments, unexpectedly overwhelmed by something as simple as that quiet gesture. Finally, she reached into her pocket, removed the little flashlight, and looked at it thoughtfully before smiling to herself. The next morning, Owen wandered into the galley expecting another ordinary breakfast and stopped short when he saw a small object resting beside the coffee tin. It was a neatly folded square of clean cloth with a narrow leather loop stitched carefully into one corner. Curious, he picked it up and immediately recognized what it was: a protective sleeve, hand-sewn to fit his pocket flashlight perfectly, complete with reinforced stitching around the edges where the metal clip usually wore through fabric. Owen slipped the flashlight inside. It fit as though the sleeve had been measured around it. He chuckled warmly, clipped it back onto his belt, and patted the little leather case once before pouring his coffee. "That's going to save me buying a new pocket," he said with genuine appreciation. Somewhere beyond the walls, hidden where she always listened during breakfast, the girl smiled into her mug of tea pleased to discover that practical gifts, according to Owen Hale, were apparently every bit as meaningful as beautiful ones. By the time the station calendar turned to a new year, Owen no longer thought of the hearth fire as a project. Projects ended. They had finish lines and inspection reports and photographs taken for proud customers before everyone moved on to the next job. The old freighter had quietly become something else entirely. It had become home in the truest sense of the word. Not because every corridor gleamed or every system had been restored, but because life had settled naturally into its corners. Saturday mornings belonged to laundry and fresh bread. Sunday afternoons were reserved for whichever repair had seemed too complicated to tackle after work during the week. Wednesday evenings almost always meant soup because Owen claimed every good mechanic should eat something that had simmered longer than an engine overhaul. The little brass clock kept steady time above the galley shelf. The tiny wooden bird remained beside it, catching the morning light, and somewhere each day another small kindness appeared, without either of them acknowledging it directly. Owen stopped wondering when the mystery had become ordinary. Instead, he caught himself leaving little observations behind almost as naturally as he left his coffee mug beside the sink. "The pantry door sticks if you close it too hard," he remarked one evening while adjusting the hinges. The next morning it swung smoothly every time. A week later he sighed while searching the galley drawers. "I swear I never remember where I put the vegetable peeler." By dinner it rested inside a small wooden tray that had somehow appeared beside the utensils, carefully divided into little compartments labeled with neat handwritten tags. Owen laughed when he found it. "Well," he admitted to the empty room, "that's a better idea than I would have had." The invisible conversation had grown so comfortable that neither of them seemed to notice it happening anymore. For the girl, the greatest surprise was not that she had begun trusting Owen, it was that she had begun expecting him. Every afternoon she found herself listening for the familiar vibration that traveled through the hull when the station tram stopped outside Dock Ring 9. A few minutes later came the unmistakable sound of Owen's boots crossing the gangway, followed by the heavy cargo hatch cycling closed behind him. Some evenings he returned carrying grocery bags. Other days it was lumber balanced awkwardly across one shoulder or an old machine part he'd rescued from work because someone had to appreciate good craftsmanship. She always knew what kind of day he'd had before he spoke a single word. If his toolbox landed with a tired thud beside the workshop bench, work had been frustrating. If he came home whistling, someone at Bay 12 had probably brought him another impossible repair just for the challenge. Occasionally he talked about his co-workers while making dinner. There was Frank, who insisted every electrical problem could be solved with a bigger fuse, despite decades of evidence to the contrary. Maria refused to retire because, according to Owen, she claimed engines behaved better when she was nearby. Young Eli had finally stopped confusing metric bolts with imperial ones, after spending an embarrassing afternoon rebuilding the same pump 3 times. The girl knew none of these people, yet over the months they had become strangely familiar through Owen's stories. Sometimes she even laughed quietly before realizing she was alone. That realization no longer startled her the way it once had. The ship had begun feeling full again, not with crowds or noise, but with life. One snowy evening, she wandered through the recreation room after Owen had gone to bed and found the old projector still waiting where he'd repaired it months before. Curious, she switched it on and searched through the archived recordings until one unfamiliar title caught her eye. Crew Talent Night, Year 14. The picture flickered into focus, revealing engineers attempting magic tricks, cargo handlers singing terribly off-key, and a captain who somehow convinced the entire crew to perform a comedy sketch that collapsed into uncontrollable laughter before anyone remembered their lines. She laughed aloud before covering her mouth, then looked around instinctively, even though she knew Owen couldn't possibly hear her from his cabin. When the recording ended, she rewound it and watched it again, realizing for the first time that the hearth fire had once been exactly what Owen was slowly making her become again. A place where ordinary people simply lived their ordinary lives together. One Friday afternoon, Owen arrived home carrying something far too large to fit comfortably through the forward hatch. After several minutes of determined maneuvering and one muttered apology to the doorframe, he finally wrestled the object into the galley and leaned it carefully against the wall with a satisfied sigh. It was an old dining table built from solid oak, scarred by years of use, but sturdy enough to outlast another generation with a little care. "Now that's proper furniture," he declared proudly, running one hand across the worn surface. The table had obviously spent decades serving family dinners somewhere on the station before finding its way into a secondhand shop. Knife marks crossed one corner. A faint ring from an old coffee mug had darkened the finish near the center. One leg wobbled slightly until Owen tightened the joints and slipped a thin wooden shim beneath the foot. By evening, it stood proudly in the middle of the galley, surrounded by four mismatched chairs collected over the previous months. Owen stepped back with his hands on his hips and laughed softly. "Bit ambitious for one person," he admitted, looking at the empty seats. "Guess I was thinking ahead." The words escaped before he could stop them. He stood quietly for a moment, studying the table, then shrugged with an embarrassed smile and began setting it anyway. One plate, one bowl, one fork, one spoon. The other places remained empty, their chairs tucked neatly beneath the table, as though patiently waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. After dinner, he washed his dishes as usual, wiped the tabletop clean, and headed for bed without another thought. Much later, the girl wandered into the galley carrying her mug of tea. She stopped the instant she saw the new table. It filled the room differently than the little folding table ever had. Somehow, it invited people to stay. She walked slowly around it, trailing her fingertips across the smooth oak until she reached the chair Owen had used that evening. The other three remained untouched. She hesitated, then gently pulled out the chair directly opposite his. Sitting there felt strangely unfamiliar. She had spent years eating perched on storage crates, workbenches, stairwells, and once, during a particularly lonely winter, on the floor beside the hydroponics garden because the growing lights made the room feel less empty. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten at a real table. Cradling her mug between both hands, she sat quietly in the chair for several minutes, imagining what the room might sound like if all four places were occupied. Laughter from the old crew recordings drifted faintly through her memory. Owen telling another story from Bay 12, dishes clinking together, someone asking for more bread. The picture felt so vivid that she almost answered an imaginary question before catching herself. Smiling at the foolish thought, she rose, pushed the chair carefully back beneath the table, and noticed something lying where her mug had rested. It was only a tiny ring of moisture on the polished oak, quickly wiped away with the corner of her sleeve. Even so, she paused before leaving the room. For the first time in many years, someone else had unknowingly shared a meal with her. They had simply done it a few hours apart. Several quiet weeks slipped by before Owen finally admitted to himself that there was one thing he wanted more than repaired engines, polished brass, or freshly painted bulkheads. He wanted to say thank you properly. The little wooden bird still stood beside the brass clock. The leather flashlight sleeve rode on his belt every day at work, earning compliments from more than one mechanic who asked where he'd bought it. Every answer was the same. "A friend made it." The word had escaped one afternoon before he even thought about it, and to his surprise, it felt completely true. Whoever lived inside the hearth fire had become part of his everyday life. They looked after the ship together. They quietly looked after each other. Yet the only words exchanged between them had been spoken into empty rooms. One snowy Sunday morning, after finishing a pot of vegetable soup, Owen dried his hands, found a clean sheet of paper from the workshop, and sat at the new oak table for nearly 20 minutes without writing a single word. Every sentence he imagined sounded too curious, too personal, or too heavy. Eventually, he laughed softly at himself, turned the paper over, and wrote only 3 short lines in careful block letters. "You don't have to answer. I just wanted to say thank you. I'm glad you're here." He folded the note once, set it in the middle of the table beside the salt shaker where it couldn't be missed, then went about the rest of his afternoon as though nothing unusual had happened. He rebuilt a sticking cabinet hinge, replaced a worn gasket beneath one of the bridge windows, and spent an hour sorting spare electrical connectors into labeled bins. Not once did he glance toward the galley to see whether the paper had disappeared. By evening, it remained exactly where he left it. He smiled to himself, made a cup of tea, and settled into the recreation room with one of the old adventure novels someone from Bay 12 had insisted he borrow. When bedtime came, the note was still waiting beneath the warm glow of the reading lamp. Owen simply nodded once, wished the ship good night out of habit, and disappeared into his cabin. He never considered taking the paper back. The girl noticed the note almost immediately after he closed his bedroom door. She stood in the hallway watching it from a distance, as though it might somehow be dangerous. Owen had left notes before, labels on storage bins, shopping lists, reminders to replace air filters, but never one that was obviously meant for her. She approached the table cautiously, unfolded the paper, and read the three short lines once, then again, then a third time. There was no question waiting to be answered. No request. No invitation to step into the light. Just gratitude. She folded the note carefully along the same crease and slipped it into her pocket before retreating into the maintenance passages without leaving any reply. For the next 3 days, it remained tucked inside the engineering notebook her mother had given her years ago. She found herself opening the notebook several times a day simply to reread those few words. "I'm glad you're here." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. For years, she had believed the safest version of herself was one nobody knew existed. Owen, somehow, had managed to make her existence feel like something worth celebrating instead of hiding. She tried writing replies dozens of times. One page simply read, "Thank you," before she crumpled it into the recycling bin. Another said, "I'm sorry I hid." That one lasted less than a minute before she tore it into tiny pieces. Every sentence felt too large, too revealing. Finally, on the fourth evening, she carried a single sheet of paper into the galley after Owen had fallen asleep. Her hands trembled so badly she had to steady them against the edge of the table before placing it where his note had been. Then she hurried away before she could lose her nerve. The following morning, Owen wandered into the galley expecting another ordinary breakfast. Instead, he stopped beside the table, coffee forgotten halfway to his lips. Resting neatly in the center was a folded piece of paper. He recognized the careful handwriting immediately, even before opening it. The letters leaned slightly to the right, pressed a little too firmly into the page as though whoever had written them wasn't entirely confident the ink would stay otherwise. Inside were only two words. "You're welcome." Owen read them once. Then again. A smile slowly spread across his face, quiet and genuine, before he folded the paper exactly as he'd found it and slipped it into the breast pocket of his work jacket. He didn't laugh. He didn't pump a fist in celebration. He didn't rush toward the maintenance passages hoping for more. Instead, he poured his coffee, buttered a slice of toast, and sat at the table for a long moment, looking out the galley window at the snow drifting lazily beyond the station lights. "Morning," he said softly into the comfortable silence. It wasn't a conversation yet, but for the first time since buying the hearth fire, it wasn't a monologue either. Somewhere beyond the walls, hidden where she always listened during breakfast, the girl smiled into her mug of tea. It was such a small thing, two handwritten words on an ordinary piece of paper. But somehow it felt louder than anything either of them had ever spoken aloud. Neither of them realized it that morning, but the hardest step had finally been taken. The silence that had protected them both for so long had begun at last to answer back. The little note that read, "You're welcome," remained tucked safely inside Owen's work jacket for nearly a week. Every morning before leaving for Bay 12, he slipped the folded paper into the breast pocket almost without thinking, and every evening, while hanging the jacket beside the galley door, he caught himself smiling as though an old friend had wished him a safe day at work. He wanted to write another note almost immediately, but experience had already taught him that patience repaired far more than urgency ever could. Whoever shared the hearth fire had spent years believing silence was the safest place in the universe. He wasn't about to overwhelm that trust because of his own excitement. So life continued in its comfortable rhythm. He rebuilt cargo loaders, repaired shuttle engines, and accepted the endless teasing from the mechanics at Bay 12, who insisted he smiled more than he used to. At home, the invisible teamwork aboard the freighter carried on as naturally as breathing. Owen repaired a leaking valve beneath the bridge, while someone quietly polished the observation windows after he went to bed. He replaced worn weather, stripping around several hatches, only to discover every loose hinge aboard the ship mysteriously lubricated before the end of the week. One evening, he remarked aloud that the pantry shelves were becoming difficult to keep organized. The following morning, every jar had been grouped by type, every label turned neatly toward the front, and a handful of small wooden dividers had somehow appeared between the rows. Owen laughed softly, resting both hands on the counter. That's considerably better than my system, he admitted to the empty room before making breakfast. It was during one of those ordinary evenings that he finally sat down at the oak table with another clean sheet of paper. This time the words came much more easily. I made too much potato soup again, he wrote in the same careful block letters. There's plenty left if you're hungry. It's always better the second day. After a moment's thought, he added one more sentence beneath it. Please don't worry about washing the bowl. I'll be doing dishes anyway. He left the note beside the stove and disappeared into the workshop for the rest of the evening, giving the galley back to its other resident. The next morning, the soup pot held noticeably less than before. One bowl rested drying neatly beside the sink, and tucked beneath it was a narrow strip of paper no larger than a shopping receipt. The handwriting leaned slightly to one side, pressed firmly into the page as though every letter required determination. You were right. It was better today. Owen read the sentence twice before folding it carefully beside the first note. He laughed quietly to himself while pouring coffee, pleased by the thought that somewhere inside the ship another person had spent the evening enjoying leftover soup and apparently shared his opinion about it. That tiny exchange opened a door neither of them realized had been waiting all along. Notes began appearing once every few days, never demanding attention and never expecting immediate replies. Owen left little observations after repairing machinery. The cargo winch finally stopped making that awful noise. The answer appeared 2 days later, only when it's warm. Sure enough, after checking before sunrise, he discovered the bearing still squeaked whenever the temperature dropped overnight. Another afternoon he wrote, "The bridge has the best sunrise on the ship." Her reply arrived beneath it in smaller handwriting. "The hydroponics room smells better." Owen couldn't argue with that. Soon the conversations wandered into harmless questions that felt less like interviews and more like neighbors chatting over a fence. "Crunchy peanut butter or smooth?" he asked one evening. The answer simply read, "Crunchy." A fresh jar quietly appeared in the pantry after Owen's next grocery trip without another word. "Favorite season?" he wrote the following week. That reply took longer. 3 days passed before she finally answered, "Spring. Things start growing again." Owen smiled at the sentence longer than he meant to. He never told her spring had always been his favorite too. Instead, a few days later, several seed catalogs appeared on the kitchen table with a note that read, "Thought you might enjoy these." When he returned from work, the catalogs had been carefully stacked again, but one page remained folded over. It showed a field of bright yellow sunflowers stretching toward a summer sky. Owen noticed the crease immediately. He didn't mention it. He simply added sunflower seeds to his shopping list the next time he visited the station market. As winter slowly began surrendering to longer days, the written conversations became one of the quiet joys both of them looked forward to without ever admitting it. Owen discovered that the girl possessed a wonderfully dry sense of humor, hidden beneath all her caution. After confessing in one note that he still couldn't whistle properly, despite decades of trying, her reply appeared beneath it the next morning. "Have you considered that the ship is protecting everyone else?" Owen laughed so hard he nearly spilled coffee across the oak table. In return, he admitted that, during his apprenticeship, he'd once installed an entire coolant pump backwards because he'd been too proud to reread the instructions. Her answer came back almost immediately. "How long before you noticed?" Owen stared at the page for a full minute before writing the painfully honest truth. About 12 seconds after turning it on. For nearly a month, their friendship continued growing this way, built from ordinary conversations about books, recipes, favorite places aboard the hearth fire, and little stories that revealed pieces of themselves without wandering into painful memories either wasn't ready to share. Then one particularly exhausting Friday evening, after spending 10 straight hours crawling through frozen coolant lines at Bay 12, Owen returned home too tired to attempt anything more ambitious than grilled cheese sandwiches and canned tomato soup. He ate quietly, washed his plate, and sat for a long while watching the brass clock tick above the tiny wooden bird. His eyes drifted toward the stack of folded notes resting inside the shallow wooden tray, where they had begun leaving messages for one another. Without really planning to, he picked up a fresh sheet of paper. The pencil hovered above it for nearly 5 minutes before finally touching the page. "May I ask you something?" he wrote. "Nothing else." He left the note beside the clock and went to bed wondering whether he should have written it at all. The following evening, after returning from the grocery store with fresh vegetables and several packets of sunflower seeds, he found the paper exactly where he'd left it. Beneath his question, written in the same careful handwriting, was a single word: yes. Owen smiled despite himself and sat down immediately. He thought carefully before writing again, determined not to waste the trust hidden inside that one simple answer. Finally, he wrote the smallest question he could imagine. "What should I call you?" As soon as the pencil left the paper, uncertainty crept in. A favorite season was one thing. A name was something else entirely. It carried history, memories, loss, and identity. He read the sentence several times before quietly adding one final line beneath it. "If you'd rather not answer, that's perfectly all right. I'll wait as long as you need." Satisfied that he'd removed every trace of pressure he could, Owen folded the note once, placed it beneath the little wooden bird where it would be easy to find, and continued with his evening exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. Days passed. The note remained untouched. Owen never replaced it, never mentioned it aloud, and never wrote another question. After the fourth morning, he began wondering whether he'd asked for too much too soon. On the fifth evening, he carried the paper back to the table, turned it over, and wrote one more short message beneath his own. "I'm sorry. You don't have to answer that. I already like having you here." He smiled to himself, folded the note again, and headed toward the workshop to finish rebuilding an old navigation console. Nearly an hour later, while searching for a screwdriver he'd misplaced, he wandered back through the galley and noticed immediately that the paper was gone. He didn't look around. He didn't call out. He simply nodded once and returned to his work. Hidden deep within the maintenance passages, the girl sat cross-legged on the narrow cot her mother had built years before, the folded note resting in her lap. She traced the words with one fingertip for a long time before reaching for a pencil. It took 6 separate attempts before her hand finally stopped shaking enough to write a single word clearly across the bottom of the page. Emma. Several days passed before Owen found the folded note waiting beneath the little wooden bird. He noticed it the moment he stepped through the galley door after work, sitting exactly where he had left his own note before leaving for Bay 12 that morning. His first instinct was to cross the room immediately, but he stopped himself almost without thinking. There was no hurry now. Whatever waited inside that folded sheet had waited patiently for him all day, and it deserved the same patience in return. He carried his lunch pail to the counter, unpacked the groceries he'd picked up on the walk home, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove before hanging his work jacket beside the door. Only after the familiar rhythm of the evening had settled around him did he walk over to the oak table and lift the note with both hands. The paper felt strangely heavy, despite weighing almost nothing. He unfolded it slowly, recognizing his own handwriting first, then the apology he'd written beneath his question several days earlier. At the bottom of the page, written carefully enough that every letter looked considered before it touched the paper, rested a single word: Emma. Owen smiled to himself. He read the name once, then again, quietly sounding it out beneath his breath as though committing it to memory. It suited her somehow, though he couldn't have explained why. Perhaps because it felt warm. Perhaps because after so many months of calling her my unseen helper in his own thoughts, finally having a real name made the ship seem just a little less lonely. He folded the paper along its original crease with the same care he had given every note she'd ever written, slipped it into the breast pocket of his work jacket beside the others, and stood for a moment looking out through the galley window at the snow drifting gently beyond the station lights. He thought about writing another note immediately, then decided against it. She had already been brave enough for one day. Instead, he quietly made dinner, humming absent-mindedly while chopping onions for a pot of stew. Halfway through peeling carrots, he glanced toward the corridor without really thinking, and spoke in exactly the same conversational tone he might have used if someone were reading a book in the next room. "Good evening, Emma." Then he continued cooking. No questions followed, no invitation to come out, no speech about finally knowing her name. Just those 3 ordinary words, offered as naturally as though he'd been saying them for years. Hidden behind the narrow maintenance access just beyond the galley wall, Emma froze with one hand resting against the cool steel. She had expected excitement, perhaps relief, Maybe even footsteps searching the hidden passages she had spent so many years calling home. Instead, Owen had simply greeted her, the way neighbors greeted one another after work, or coworkers passing in a hallway, or friends sharing the same house at different hours. He hadn't wanted her name because names solved mysteries. He had wanted it because names belonged in conversations. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, that realization eased a fear she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. She remained hidden until long after Owen had gone to bed, then quietly stepped into the galley, touched the back of the chair where he had eaten dinner only an hour before, and smiled to herself when she noticed he had absent-mindedly left one of the carrots slightly overcooked. It was a wonderfully ordinary mistake, and somehow that made him feel more familiar than ever. The weeks that followed settled into the easiest rhythm either of them had known in years. Their notes still appeared in the little wooden tray on the kitchen table, but now they began with names instead of uncertainty. Morning, Emma. Good luck replacing that ventilation fan today, Owen. Don't forget the bread in the oven, Emma. Too late. The first time Owen found his own name written in her careful handwriting, he sat at the table for several minutes with his coffee growing cold simply because seeing those 5 letters somehow made him feel younger than he had in a long time. It reminded him of being an apprentice again, when friendships formed naturally through shared work and long afternoons spent solving problems together. Before long, the notes became less like conversations between two strangers and more like the comfortable exchanges of people sharing the same home while living on different schedules. Emma began asking engineering questions she had quietly collected over the years. Why did Owen always tighten bolts in a crisscross pattern? How could he tell whether an engine bearing was beginning to fail simply by listening? Why did he insist on repairing old tools instead of buying new ones whenever he could afford it? Owen answered every question with sketches, diagrams, and little stories from decades spent working around machinery. In return, Emma showed him shortcuts through the hearth fire that only someone raised inside her hidden passages could possibly know. She drew careful maps of forgotten service tunnels, pointed out inspection ports concealed behind decorative wall panels, and listed dozens of tiny maintenance quirks no original blueprint had ever recorded. Together, without ever standing in the same room, they finished the last of the ship's restoration. The stubborn ventilation fan above the recreation room finally fell silent. Every cabin once again had reliable heat and running water. Fresh paint covered the final stretch of rusted corridor near the aft cargo bay, and the bridge instruments glowed warmly beneath polished glass instead of flickering uncertainly through decades of neglect. Meanwhile, life aboard the hearthfire quietly became richer in 100 ordinary ways. The sunflower seeds Owen had bought after noticing the folded page in the seed catalog grew tall enough to brush the hydroponic lights, their bright yellow blooms turning faithfully toward the artificial sunrise each morning. The pantry filled with homemade jam after Emma discovered an old recipe tucked inside one of the galley cookbooks. Owen baked bread almost every Saturday, claiming practice was the only cure for crooked loaves, while Emma privately decided crooked bread was beginning to look exactly the way bread should. Station workers continued dropping off old furniture, spare machine parts, and boxes of forgotten books simply because they knew Owen would find a use for them. None of them realized another pair of hands quietly restored each gift after dark. Months earlier, the hearth fire had felt like an abandoned ship waiting for someone to rescue her. Now she felt exactly what she had always been meant to be, a home. And somewhere inside that home, without either of them planning it or even noticing precisely when it happened, 2 lonely people had quietly stopped living alone. The first warm morning of spring arrived quietly, announced less by the station calendar than by the subtle changes aboard the hearthfire herself. Condensation no longer gathered around the bridge windows before dawn, the heating system cycled less frequently, and the hydroponics room had become so full of growing things that opening its door released the unmistakable scent of damp soil, fresh herbs, and tomato vines into the surrounding corridors. The sunflowers Owen had planted after discovering the folded seed catalog page now stood shoulder high, their broad yellow faces following the artificial daylight with cheerful determination. He stopped to admire them almost every morning before leaving for Bay 12, usually finding one small handwritten note tucked somewhere among the planters. Sometimes Emma reminded him to buy coffee because the last tin was nearly empty. Other mornings, she pointed out a valve that deserved attention before it became a larger problem. Their conversations had become so wonderfully ordinary that Owen occasionally forgot they still hadn't stood face to face. One evening, she asked whether he thought the old auxiliary engines would ever run again. Owen answered with 3 pages of sketches explaining exactly what remained to be rebuilt, adding little arrows and notes in the margins until the diagrams looked more like lessons than replies. The following afternoon, he discovered several remarkably clever corrections penciled beside his drawings. Emma had noticed a fuel return line that could be rerouted more efficiently through an unused service channel she remembered from childhood. Owen stared at the revised sketch for several minutes before laughing quietly to himself. "I hadn't even thought of that," he wrote beneath her drawing. "That's a better solution than mine." Her reply consisted of only one sentence. "Mom always said ships teach the people who listen to them." Owen carried that thought with him throughout the rest of the week. More and more, he found himself realizing that, while he had spent months teaching Emma everything he knew about machinery, she had quietly been teaching him the hearthfire herself. She knew which hatch squeaked only during rainy weather, which water pipes warmed first every morning, and which corridor always smelled faintly of cinnamon because decades earlier someone had stored spices behind a panel that still carried the scent. She remembered little details no blueprint could ever preserve because they belonged to people rather than engineering. The old freighter was no longer simply a collection of repaired systems beneath Owen's careful hands. Through Emma's stories, she had become a place filled with birthdays, bedtime stories, scraped knees, growing tomatoes, rainy afternoons spent reading beside warm engine rooms, and a mother who had somehow transformed an aging cargo ship into a child's home. Owen understood now why Emma had fought so hard to keep her alive. The hearthfire wasn't merely where she had survived. She was where every happy memory Emma possessed still lived. Several evenings later, Owen returned home to find the familiar wooden tray empty. That alone wasn't unusual. Their notes often spent a day or two tucked inside jacket pockets or engineering manuals before being answered. What caught his attention instead was the old waterproof binder resting quietly in the center of the oak table. He recognized it immediately. It was older than any maintenance manual he'd found while restoring the ship, its faded canvas cover carefully cleaned despite decades of use. The corners softened from countless hands opening and closing it over the years. Resting on top was a single folded sheet bearing his name. Owen unfolded it slowly. "I think you're ready now. This belonged to my mom. It belongs to both of us now." He remained standing for a long while, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, looking from the note to the journal without touching either again. Somehow he understood that this gift was unlike every other Emma had shared with him. The flashlight sleeve had protected a tool. The little wooden bird had carried a memory. Her name had carried trust. This carried an entire life. He made himself a cup of tea almost entirely from habit, carried both mug and journal into the recreation room, and settled beneath the warm reading lamp, where the quiet ticking of the brass clock drifted faintly from the galley. The first pages looked exactly as he'd expected. Careful engineering notes filled with dates, maintenance schedules, inspection reports, and repair diagrams drawn with remarkable precision. Whoever had written them possessed the calm confidence of someone who had spent years caring for ships. Gradually, almost without notice, tiny glimpses of another life appeared between the technical entries. Emma insisted on holding the flashlight today. Mostly she illuminated the ceiling, but enthusiasm counts for something. Several pages later came another. She can finally tell the difference between a 12mm wrench and a 13. I celebrated by pretending not to notice when she stole one for her very important toolbox. Owen smiled despite himself, easily imagining a little girl proudly collecting mismatched tools far too large for her hands. More pages turned. First tomato harvested today. Emma declared it tasted better because we grew it ourselves. Another. Power outage lasted 43 minutes. Emma wasn't frightened. She reminded me where we keep the emergency lanterns. The journal never lingered on sentimentality. It simply recorded a mother watching her daughter grow up aboard the ship they both loved. Then the handwriting slowly began to change. Not all at once, but gradually enough that Owen almost missed it. The neat lettering grew less steady. Entries became shorter. Maintenance schedules stretched farther apart. Medicine making me tired now. Several pages later, Emma fixed the circulation pump while I rested. She didn't think I noticed. I did. Then, teaching her the emergency shutdown tomorrow, just in case. Owen swallowed quietly before turning another page. The final entry written in the mother's hand contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. The next page belonged entirely to Emma. Large, careful letters. Changed air filter. Nothing else. Another page. Tomatoes need water tomorrow. Another. Couldn't reach valve. Used ladder. The handwriting grew steadier as months quietly slipped past. The entries never spoke directly about loneliness or grief. They didn't need to. Every repaired pump, every replaced filter, every carefully recorded inspection carried the same quiet message. She had simply kept going. The little girl whose mother once praised her for holding a flashlight had become the ship's only engineer because there had been no one else left to do the work. Owen read until the final page, where the familiar handwriting from every note in the wooden tray waited for him one last time. Today, Owen fixed the bridge windows. Tomorrow, we're repainting the aft corridor. The ship laughs more now. He closed the journal gently, resting both hands on its worn cover as evening sunlight faded through the recreation room windows. For a long while, he simply sat there listening to the familiar sounds surrounding him. The quiet hum of restored ventilation fans, the soft ticking of the brass clock, distant water moving peacefully through pipes that both he and Emma had repaired with their own hands. He understood now that the journal had never really been about engines or pumps or maintenance schedules. It was the story of a home that refused to stop living, carried first by a mother and then by a daughter until, one ordinary afternoon, an aging mechanic unknowingly walked aboard and picked up the work where they had left off. For the next several days, the journal remained exactly where Owen had closed it. He carried it back to the oak table that same evening, wrapped it once again in its faded waterproof cloth, and laid it carefully beside the little wooden tray that had held so many notes over the past months. He never wrote about what he had read. Somehow it felt too personal, too sacred to answer with words. Instead, life aboard the hearth fire settled into a quiet that neither of them found uncomfortable. Owen still left before sunrise each morning, with his lunch pail tucked beneath one arm and his worn work jacket buttoned against the lingering spring chill. He still returned every afternoon carrying another small improvement for the ship or another amusing story from Bay 12 that he intended to write down later. Emma still tended the hydroponics garden, adjusted pumps before they could fail, and wandered through the hidden maintenance passages, listening to the familiar sounds of a ship that no longer groaned with neglect, but hummed contentedly beneath steady hands. Yet something invisible had changed between them. The notes stopped because they no longer seemed necessary. Everything important had already been said. Owen understood where Emma had come from. Emma knew Owen understood. There was a remarkable peace in that knowledge. Sometimes, while replacing a worn relay or repainting another stretch of corridor, Owen caught himself smiling at memories from the journal that had nothing to do with him. He imagined a little girl proudly carrying a flashlight too heavy for her hands, or celebrating the first tomato harvested from the hydroponics bay. Those moments no longer belonged only to Emma and her mother. Through the gift of that weathered binder, she had quietly invited Owen into them as well. He honored that invitation the only way he knew how, by continuing the work they had both begun long before he arrived. Together, though never side by side, they finished the last unfinished jobs aboard the old freighter. The final section of faded paint disappeared beneath fresh coats of warm gray enamel. The auxiliary engines, silent for decades, finally turned over under their own power, before settling into the deep, steady rhythm of machinery, grateful to be working again. Every navigation light shone brightly across the hull. Every cabin welcomed visitors with clean sheets, warm air, and working lights. One afternoon, after completing the final inspection required by the station authority, Owen stood alone on the bridge, holding a stamped certificate declaring the hearth fire fully spaceworthy for the first time in more than 30 years. He looked around the quiet bridge, smiled toward the empty doorway, and simply said, "We did it." Somewhere beyond the walls, Emma smiled too. The following Saturday arrived bright and unusually warm. Sunlight poured through the bridge windows, casting long, golden rectangles across the galley floor, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the forward section of the ship. Owen woke earlier than usual for no particular reason and decided the morning deserved pancakes. The batter came together almost automatically after years of practice, though he still managed to splash a little milk across the counter while reaching for the flour. He chuckled at himself, wiped it up with a dish towel, and poured the first round onto the hot griddle. The familiar hiss filled the galley as butter melted across the surface. Outside, station traffic moved lazily through the docking lanes, unhurried in the weekend calm. Inside, the hearth fire felt wonderfully still. Owen flipped the pancakes, reached into the refrigerator for butter, and turned back toward the stove. He stopped. Emma stood quietly in the doorway. She wore faded work pants with one knee carefully patched, an oversized gray shirt with the sleeves rolled nearly to her elbows, and a pair of well-worn work boots that looked as though they had belonged to someone much taller before years of careful repairs had given them a second life. A pencil rested behind one ear. There was a faint streak of grease across the back of one hand, and another smudge near her cheek where she had apparently forgotten to wipe it away. She looked exactly like every apprentice mechanic Owen had ever met, except for the unmistakable uncertainty in her eyes. For a few long moments, neither of them moved. They had imagined this meeting so many different ways over the past months that reality somehow became wonderfully simple by comparison. Owen recognized her immediately, not because he had ever seen her face before, but because every tiny detail about her fit the person he had come to know through notes, repaired machinery, crooked jokes, carefully tended gardens, and quiet acts of kindness. Emma studied him with the same quiet curiosity. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps, and the gray in his beard caught the morning light more than she expected. His hands looked exactly right, though, strong, scarred, and permanently stained in the creases by decades of honest work. They were the hands that had rebuilt her home one careful repair at a time. Owen's smile appeared first, gentle and completely free of surprise. "Morning, Emma." She drew a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Morning, Owen." The silence that followed no longer felt like distance. It felt comfortable. Owen glanced toward the griddle and laughed softly. "I think I left those on a little too long." Emma looked past him just in time to see the edges of the pancakes turning a shade darker than intended. To Owen's surprise, and her own, a quiet laugh escaped her. It wasn't loud, but it was real, bright enough to fill the little galley more completely than any conversation could have. Owen rescued the pancakes with exaggerated seriousness, inspecting one before declaring, "Well, I'd call that golden with character." Emma smiled wider. "Crooked bread," she replied, "and now crooked pancakes." Owen pointed the spatula toward her with mock offense. "I've developed a reputation." "You have," she answered, stepping fully into the room for the first time in years. Without needing to ask, Owen reached into the cupboard for a second plate. Emma walked to the oak table and pulled out the chair opposite his, the very chair where she had once sat alone in the middle of the night, imagining what breakfast with another person might feel like. Now the morning sunlight spilled across both places at once. They ate slowly, talking about nothing especially important: the pancakes, the sunflowers that were nearly tall enough to brush the hydroponic lights, whether the station bakery really made better cinnamon rolls than Owen insisted he could bake himself. Ordinary conversation filled the spaces where silence had once lived. Neither of them mentioned hidden passages, lonely years, or everything that had brought them to this table. They didn't have to. Their friendship had already been built one note, one repair, and one quiet act of trust at a time. This breakfast was simply the first time they happened to be sitting in the same room while sharing it. The weeks that followed passed so naturally that, months later, neither Owen nor Emma could remember exactly when sharing the hearth fire stopped feeling new and simply became life. They settled into routines that fit together as comfortably as the countless repaired systems humming quietly beneath the decks. Owen still spent his days at Bay 12, though he now found himself returning home with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. The mechanics noticed the change long before he did. Frank eventually stopped pretending not to be curious and leaned against a workbench one afternoon while Owen cleaned grease from an injector housing. "Whatever you've been smiling about these last few months," he said, "keep doing it. Makes the rest of us look less miserable." Owen only chuckled, wiped his hands on a shop towel, and replied that restoring an old ship was finally beginning to pay off. It wasn't exactly the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Every evening he crossed the gangway, carrying groceries, spare parts, or the occasional armful of lumber, always wondering what project Emma had quietly started while he was away. Sometimes she left a list on the kitchen table reminding him that the pantry needed flour or that the bridge coffee pot had finally given up after decades of faithful service. Other days she simply greeted him with a cheerful, "Evening, Owen," written on a folded note beside the kettle, even though she was no longer hiding from him. She still valued her quiet hours, and Owen respected them without question. They often worked on opposite ends of the ship, meeting naturally for meals rather than forcing conversation every waking moment. It was an easy companionship, one that neither demanded nor measured affection because it had long ago become woven into the ordinary rhythm of their days. The sunflower garden grew into a bright wall of yellow blossoms that greeted anyone entering the hydroponics bay. The crooked loaves of Saturday bread remained stubbornly crooked despite Owen's best efforts, and Emma eventually admitted she had been secretly trimming the bottoms of every loaf before serving them because it was easier than convincing him to watch the oven more carefully. Owen declared that an outrageous abuse of authority for someone who had only recently become his unofficial assistant baker. Emma answered that someone clearly needed to supervise quality control. Their laughter echoed through the galley often enough now that the old freighter seemed to carry it from one end of the ship to the other, filling corners that had once known only silence. Almost a year after Emma first wrote her name beneath Owen's question, the station authority approved the Hearthfire's final departure inspection. The old freighter no longer resembled the abandoned vessel Owen had purchased with nearly every dollar he owned. Fresh paint gleamed beneath the docking lights. Every navigation beacon shone brightly against the polished hull. The engines settled into a deep, confident rhythm that could be felt through the deck plates long before they could be heard. Word spread quietly through Bay 12 that the old mechanic's impossible restoration had actually succeeded, and on the morning of their departure, a surprising number of people found reasons to linger along the observation rail overlooking Dock Ring 9. Frank arrived carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and insisted one belonged to Owen whether he wanted it or not. Maria walked slowly around the ship, running one weathered hand along the hull before smiling to herself. Even young Eli appeared with a small wooden plaque he had made in the station workshop. Burned neatly into its polished surface were the words Hearthfire Engineering Department, followed by 2 names beneath them, Owen Hale, Emma. Owen accepted it with quiet gratitude before fastening it beside the workshop door, exactly where everyone boarding the ship would see it. Emma stood nearby, looking slightly overwhelmed by the attention, until Maria wandered over and handed her a heavy canvas tool roll, wrapped in faded blue cloth. "Every mechanic deserves tools of her own," the older woman said simply. Emma opened it to find a beautifully maintained set of hand tools, each one worn smooth by years of honest work. She looked up, unsure what to say. Maria only smiled. "Take care of that old ship." Emma nodded, her voice almost disappearing. "I will." When the docking clamps finally released with a deep metallic thud, Owen settled into the captain's chair, while Emma moved naturally to the engineering console. Not because anyone had assigned those positions, but because that was where each of them belonged. One by one, the systems came alive beneath their hands. Docking umbilicals disconnected. Thrusters responded. Navigation displays brightened across the bridge. Owen glanced toward Emma. "Engine report?" She looked over the instruments with the calm confidence earned through years of listening to the heartbeat of the ship. Main engines steady, auxiliary systems green, all temperatures normal. She paused, smiling to herself before adding, "She's ready." The Hearthfire slipped gently away from Dock Ring 9, her engines pushing her into open space with the quiet assurance of a ship finally doing what she had been built to do. The station grew smaller beyond the bridge windows, its lights reflecting softly across the polished glass, while stars slowly replaced steel as the view ahead widened into endless darkness, scattered with distant suns. Owen rested one hand lightly on the controls, making tiny course adjustments more out of habit than necessity. Beside him, Emma watched the engine displays for another moment before finally allowing herself to look forward instead. She had spent almost her entire life within sight of that station. For years, it had represented the edge of her world. Now it drifted peacefully behind them, not as something they were escaping, but as a place they would always remember with gratitude. It had given Owen a chance to find an old forgotten freighter. It had given Emma the time she needed to trust another person again. Ahead lay nothing extraordinary. No urgent mission, no hidden treasure, no great adventure waiting beyond the next star. There would be cargo to haul, engines to maintain, groceries to buy at unfamiliar ports, and more crooked loaves of bread than either of them would probably admit to baking. There would be mornings spent arguing over coffee strength, afternoons repairing pumps that stubbornly refused to cooperate, and evenings watching sunflowers sway gently beneath the hydroponic lights while stories drifted through the galley. It was, by almost every measure, an ordinary future. For Owen and Emma, it was everything they had ever hoped to find. The old hearth fire, once abandoned and forgotten, carried them quietly toward it.